I think what I was getting to was that bourbon is so good it doesn't need the secondary cask, whereas Scotch is crap.
Oh, no.
And it does,
no.
because Scotch without the sherry cask is
Amazing.
undrinkable. I could drink all day, like breakfast, lunch, dinner. Like, I don't care.
You can't drink out of this glass for shit.
Well, the problem, actually, James, I'm sorry to get rude so quickly as you.
I'm going to bring up Ohio at any given cost.
Nobody should be putting this stuff in their body.
I smell metal and Greek.
The perfect bourbon is Michter's 10-year-old.
Oh, that's junk. Oh, that's junk.
Welcome to Whiskey Uncut. I'm your host, Paul, joined by co-host James.
Co-host, yeah.
I got to get used to saying that.
I know. And we should start by saying this almost didn't happen today because Paul forgot it was Sunday.
Yeah, I didn't know. I've been a day off all week.
I don't know how you forget,
dude,
that it's Sunday, but we made it.
We made it. So our focus for today's episode is going to be Sherry Casks.
And I'm excited about this because I don't know jack shit about Sherry Casks. And my guess is that most people who drink bourbon and rye do not. Because it's just not something that's really common in American whiskey at all. But obviously, Scotch is an entirely different world. So I'm curious to see what you come up with here because I don't know that much.
So I'm going to go into a couple of facets to this. As we're talking about at the beginning of this, we were drinking Glenfarclas, 25 years old. So I just jumped right to a big
right
boy
to it, yeah.
For you. So Glenfarclas, 25 years old. Glenfarclas is a small family-owned independent distillery in Scotland, one of the few remaining. And the 25 years old is aged. They don't explicitly say whether it's exclusively in sherry casks or not, but it is not heavily sherried. It's about a medium sherry finish. So it's definitely noticeable. I would say sherry is still kind of maybe the dominant flavor, but there's a decent amount of grassiness, of oak, of dryness there, but it's not quite a sherry bomb. And so the reason I've got that, then we have the Balvenie 15-year-old single barrel, which is all sherry, heavy sherry. And then you brought the Middle West sherry finish. So we've got a few different ones to try and talk about, but basically with sherry casks, the conception of what a sherry cask is that, or what it should be, is that it should be European oak from Spain, and it should have held mature sherry, like good quality sherry that was intended to be drunk. And what we've seen a lot happen in recent years is so much more demand for whiskey than sherry that now they have to produce sherry just to season these barrels. And I'll get into some specifics about what that means in a minute. But that seasoning process is, what does that mean? You know, what sherry is it that's going in there? Like, nobody knows, right? So when you read sherry cask on a label, it no longer really means the same thing it used to mean. And when we talked about in episode 1 with the dusty whiskeys about the old, like, why does old Scotch have this like mystique on it? And I don't mean old like old age number on the bottle. I mean old Scotch, like vintage from like the 1980s, 1970s, 1960s. And I was telling you about a product that they used I couldn't remember the name of, but it's called paxarette. And so paxarette was a product that used to be involved in the sherry process that modified the flavor. And so then it was in the Scotch as well. And so I'll get a little bit into that. But so I'll start with just kind of the sherry cask in general. And this is from Master of Malt, has a good write-up on this. And so I'm just going to borrow a little bit of it because it's more organized than I could just spout off the top of my head. But basically, for those who don't know, sherry is from Jerez, Spain, is the predominant, region of quality sherry. And the sherry is being aged in barrels in Spain and then transported to Scotland, right? So when you think of a sherry cask, do you think of the sherry cask that the sherry was aged in, or the sherry was transported in, if you had to guess?
I would say that it was aged in.
Correct. And that's what most people think. That's what everybody
and I'm guessing
thinks.
it's wrong.
And that's wrong. Yeah.
So not correct.
Right.
But yes.
So yeah, not correct. So everyone always thinks when they get their bottle of whiskey and they read Sherry Cask on there, they think, oh, this is from a barrel that held sherry in it for a long time. You know, it especially like Dalmore does this. They say like from casks containing, 30-year-old Methuselah sherry or, whatever. And they make you think that this cask has been soaking in the sherry for 30 years, right?
But they never say how long the sherry was actually in there.
Correct.
It's just, yeah.
The sherry cask is aging sherry in Spain, and then that sherry is put into a second barrel that is typically a fresh barrel, a fresh Spanish oak barrel that hasn't been used before, and transported. And those were the barrels which already ended up in Scotland and England and Ireland. And so they had them laying around. So then they put their whiskey in it, right? They didn't have like this barrel that was sitting there for a long, long time in Spain with sherry in it and then load that onto the boat. And it's a subtle distinction because you've asked me in the past, how come like if you're aging a whiskey in a sherry cask, why would you be worried about like it getting over oaked at all? Like the sherry has already sucked all the oak influence out, but it hasn't.
That's why. So so this goes back to what you mentioned in the beginning. You're really just seasoning a barrel with sherry.
Correct. It's
prior to putting your scotch in it.
Yep. It's always been sherry seasoned.
Got it.
Like that's always been the case. It's always been sherry seasoned barrels. But the mentality of like, oh, well, these barrels are only holding sherry for a short period of time is kind of flawed. That's not really a difference from the way it used to be done either. The difference is what sherry is being put.
The quality of the sherry that's actually being made. And did your article that you were reading say anything about why the sherry wasn't just shipped over in its original barrel, or is it just the size of the barrels?
Yes. So in addition to sherry needing to be aged in 500 to 600 liter oak barrels, which are 3 times the size of a standard American barrel.
That's part of the problem.
That's part of the problem.
It's hard to ship those giant containers filled with thousands and thousands of pounds of sherry.
Right.
So.
In addition, before an oak barrel is qualified to be used in the sherry maturation process, it must first be used to ferment grape musts or age young fortified wines for 3 years by law. So before you can even put sherry in a barrel to age the sherry, it has to already be a 3-year-old barrel,
right?
Which is going to soak up a lot of that oak out of there. So this means by the time an oak barrel is used to age sherry, the impact of wood is more or less exhausted. In fact, sherry doesn't get flavors from oak barrels, and many sherry casks used to age sherry in Jerez are decades old, right? As long as they're not leaking, basically.
Right. And so that's the key, is it has to have had spirit in it for at least 3 years, but many of them are probably super, super old. They've been used many times over and over again.
Yep. Because the goal for the sherry producer is not to get an oak aged product. It's the oxidation and the fermentation and everything that happens to the sherry just being stored somewhere. Right. They might as well use stainless steel, but it's traditional to use oak. And I'm sure there's a slight difference because the oak,
I'm sure you're still getting something in there. Yeah, that's different.
So anyway, that is the primary difference of what most people think sherry casks are versus what the reality is, which is they are the transport barrels. Now, the paxarette issue that we brought up with the dusty whiskeys, paxarette is basically a product that is made from sherry. It's like sherry concentrate. And so
it's like chicken stock, but for sherry.
Yes.
Because I remember I looked this up after you talked about it. And yeah, it's just like literally a concentrated form, right? That they were allowed to add at the time that they're not allowed to add now.
And so that is what they used up until, and I was trying to find the date.
Were they just adding this directly to the Scotch or
both? So they were, yeah. So basically they were putting it into barrels that didn't even have sherry in it at all. and using that
to season the
to
barrel.
make the barrel season.
Gotcha.
They were adding it to sherry casks to like punch
doing
it up
everything with it.
Right.
Yeah.
They were doing whatever they wanted with it. Yeah. So
no
adding
wonder some of
paxarette,
those are like super ass fruity. Like
yes.
Yeah.
And here's the thing: the Scotch industry, again, like similar to the sherry people, a lot of times the Scotch guys don't want a ton of oak influence, right? And so they want to use their barrels multiple times. Well, if you soak up all your sherry the first time you use the barrel, what are you going to do? You're going to dump some paxarette in it each subsequent time you fill it up to re-season it.
Right.
So every time a sherry butt or hogshead was emptied, the color of the whiskey would be checked. And if it was believed that the cask needed a bit of a boost before the next fill, just a little bit of paxarette would be added, either by the cupful or in some cases injected with compressed air.
Oh man. So pushing it into the wood.
Yeah. So
wow.
so that's the whole other layer, is like there was all this unregulated, stuff going on. And to some extent there still is, like with the natural coloring, right?
Yeah.
Or the caramel coloring.
And so let me put this back together. So you have, like, let's say you and I are a Scotch producer. We contact somebody in Oloroso, say, hey, we want Oloroso
in Jerez.
Yeah, in Jerez. Sorry, you know
Oloroso.
what I meant.
Yeah, I knew what you meant.
I meant somebody who makes Oloroso sherry.
Yeah.
So we contact somebody who makes Oloroso sherry, and we say, hey, send us some product.
Right.
So they then transfer that out of their giant, huge barrels, put it into
smaller barrels for shipping.
Right. Yeah. Ship it back. What happens to the sherry then once it gets to?
They dump it.
They just get rid of it.
Yeah. Or they just hang on to it, put it somewhere, and then they can re-season their barrel with it again later after they use the barrel. Okay.
So that's what I assumed happened. So that goes back to my question that we were talking about. So is it all just shit sherry?
Well, so that's the debate now, right?
I understand that people now are making shit sherry.
Yes.
And they're seasoning barrels.
But back then,
even
then, there would have been some shit sherry or casks, because again, the casks.
I guess I'm thinking of this from the producer.
Right. So let me put it in like a logistical sense, right? How long do you think it takes a boat to get from Spain to Scotland? Probably not that long. Back in the 1700s, maybe a couple months, or a month, at most, right? But that's not a lot of time for the sherry to soak into the wood. But what would really happen is, like, all the sherry barrels get there and they weren't bottling it. They were rolling their barrel to the pub and putting it behind the bar, and then they were serving out of it. So it would probably be months before it was emptied, and then they would drop it off at the distillery. Right?
Okay, so people were drinking the sherry.
Correct.
Okay,
but
that was my point, because like if they were just going to be dumping it, or if they weren't using it, or if they were just reusing it to like season new barrels. If I'm the producer that's making the Oloroso sherry, I'm not going to send you good sherry. I'm going to send you garbage.
Now,
that you're going to get rid of.
Yeah, which is more the case now, because if you look at a graph of the sherry industry and sherry sales, it took a nosedive in the 70s. And it's like, it's just a fraction of what the Scotch industry needs now. So
just everything just blinked.
All the lights. Yeah, I forgot to unplug that little mini fridge. It's shorting out my electrical system.
That's bad that it's a mini fridge. But
yeah,
so that's what's happening now, is there's no way that the sherry production can actually keep up with the demand for Scotch.
Correct. And so they're producing sherry for the intent of seasoning it, rather than, the traditional sense was they're using sherry casks because we're drinking sherry, and so there's barrels showing up anyway that we need to do something with, and so we're going to put our whiskey in them.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So the whole myth of it being garbage sherry is probably true, but maybe in a slightly different
in a different sense. It's not the cask itself that's like a garbage single-use cask that hasn't been aging sherry for a long time. That was always never the case. That was never the case.
Yeah. And that's different. And we're used to American spirits too, where like we just did an apple brandy finish thing. We did a rum finish thing. Like when I put in the rum cask, when I put the rye whiskey in the rum cask, the rum had been aging in there for 7 years.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, that's not long considering like Scotch, and you see like a lot of these really old sherries and things like that. But still, like the assumption is that this, whatever it was aging in there for a very long period of time, or an extended period of time.
And so now this brings up a secondary issue of when you're trying to decipher off a label what a whiskey is going to taste like, right? So go ahead and try the second one, the Balvenie that I just poured for you.
Are we comparing this with the first one?
Yeah, with
the first one's very light to me. It's a little bit fruity on the nose, but it smells more scotchy still than it does sherry.
And it's very well balanced.
It's super fruity and
mild.
Like, nice.
Yeah.
I really like the nose on that.
It's a very elegant dram.
Oh yeah, the Balvenie's like a sledgehammer.
Yeah. So the Balvenie jumps up in proof. It goes from 43 ABV to 48. Technically 47.8.
Wow, that's rich.
That's really rich. And if you look at it on camera, I mean, it's black. You can't see through it, right?
That's like a damn dessert.
Yeah. So that's a first fill sherry cask, right? The Glenfarclas is most likely a refill sherry cask. And by refill, that means it was used to hold whiskey once before, and now this is the second time whiskey's been put in it. Or at least there's a blend of barrels used to produce this, and some were refill, some were first fill. Whereas the Balvenie is single barrel from a first fill barrel. But let me ask you, James, if you're the person enforcing these laws of what, when they put on the label first fill, do you think, let's say I get my sherry cask off the boat from Spain, dump the sherry out, or drink it or, whatever, put my whiskey in it. That's a first fill barrel, right?
Yes.
Now I put sherry in the barrel again. And now I pour that out and put whiskey in it. Is it a first fill sherry cask?
My guess is that they're allowed to call it that.
I don't know.
But I don't know.
And
it shouldn't be.
And it's really hard to find an answer on this, right?
Yeah.
Because no one's going to disclose like
so if they reseason it,
right?
Is it still a first fill?
Right. And if it's a refill cask, like let's say you get a whiskey that they're using refill casks. What good does that do you? Because you don't actually know that second fill just went straight to whiskey again. You don't know that they didn't reseason it with sherry, right? So and I bring this up because in the Scotch community, there's a big deal made about first fill sherry casks. Like they're the holy grail of, to a lot of enthusiasts, that's all they want. Like, and you get a premium. First fill sherry casks always cost more, because it's like it's just so intense. It's more rare. Obviously, because it can only be the first time, but it begs the question of how honest are these producers being from the Scotch side of what they're calling a first fill.
What actually constitutes a first fill.
Correct.
Now, I will say this, though. Every time you've given me what's considered a first fill, it is much more sherry influence than anything else.
Yeah.
So there's something to it. But you said you've looked and there's no regulation as to what a first fill actually means.
I mean, well, that's what it means. But I'm saying think about it from the from the bourbon side, right? Bourbon, the definition is virgin American oak cask that's aged 3 years, and made in America, distilled in America, or whatever, and aged in America. Not distilled to whatever proof, that has no additives. You put that in a sherry barrel. Technically, sherry has now been added to your bourbon.
Yes.
Is it still bourbon? Right. So like everybody just kind of ignores that. Not everybody. Some people get pissed off about it. But the point is, like, from a regulatory standpoint, do you consider it still a first fill cask if it's the first time whiskey's been put in it since the last time sherry was put
in it? Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm surprised that some of these get as much sherry flavor out of them
as they do.
Yeah, considering, now you told this whole story. I'm surprised that they, especially if it's not a first use, like how in the hell do you extract any more sherry out of that?
Right. And so that was the big thing that people, in addition to the presumption that a lot of people have that it used to be these aged barrels holding the sherry that were being used, and that it's the cheap sherry getting put in there now. The second thing is like, oh, well, they're only seasoning it for like 6 months. with the sherry, with this cheap sherry. It was always only seasoned.
It's always been like that. Well, and that's my other question was how long then does the Scotch stay in it? Some of them are like the whole lifetime of the Scotch, right?
Right.
Others, is it
6
more
months.
ambiguous? You just don't know?
Or you don't know. Yeah. Or, in the case of the Glenfarclas, it's a blend of multiple barrels. So some barrels could be ex-bourbon barrels, some could be sherry.
Yeah, you just have no idea what's going on with that.
And, depending on the distillery, they may provide more or less information. We've talked about that before, is like how legally binding is any of that when they say a higher percentage of first fill sherry. Is that one more barrel? Technically,
that's like it is a higher percentage,
right?
Yeah.
So
it kind of reminds me a little bit of small batch in bourbon.
Correct.
Like,
yeah, exactly.
It sort of is what it sounds like, right? Like first fill barrel, small batch. Like it is what it sounds like. But when you really think about it, it means jack squat shit.
Mm-hmm.
Like it just means that you made less of that than you did something else in your distillery. So it's kind of the same deal.
And so,
but these are two incredibly different whiskeys.
And so when I reached out to Balvenie and I asked them about this particular, the 15-year-old single barrel, because it is not labeled as first fill sherry cask, and you can go out and you can buy bottles of this that have the same color as like the Balvenie 12-year-old. They're really light, right?
Well, and they add color, so you have no idea.
This
what
one
the color.
doesn't.
Okay, that one doesn't.
The single barrel, they don't add color,
but other bottles they could, and so they could play mind tricks with you too in terms of how much sherry influence is actually in the whiskey.
Right. So I reached out to Balvenie about their single barrel line, and I asked them, I said, so why don't you label some as first fill, some as second fill, when it's obvious from a taste perspective and visual perspective, looking at the color, how drastically different the sherry influences? And their response was, some second fill barrels taste just like a first fill barrel, right? And I was like thinking about that, and I was like, well, that actually makes sense, because let's say you're making a whiskey that you only want to have it in a sherry cask for a month. It's not soaking up all that sherry influence in a month, right? So now it's a second fill cask, but it's basically going to taste identical to a first fill cask.
And do they proof the whiskey down before they put it in the barrel, or do they proof it afterwards? Afterwards. Okay.
Yeah. Now, because if you proofed your whiskey down ahead of time in Scotland, you'd run into too many issues where the proof dropped.
But I'm saying if it's not going to stay in there for very long, like maybe they drop it down to 100.
Well, no,
or something like that.
No, when they do that, they would have already aged the whiskey for like 12. Oh yeah. Okay. I see what you're saying. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cause they would have already aged the whiskey for like 12 or 15 years in a bourbon barrel. And then they're just dipping it in sherry to finish it off. So you're right. They technically could proof it ahead of doing that, but I don't think they do.
I'm always really interested. I mean, barrel finishing is something that I've gotten really interested about, since the Two Souls stuff, because I think in general, people finish stuff way too long. Yeah. And it seems like here, like you're just kind of all over the place. And one of the things we try to do is be really transparent about how long, like we give you, if you look at our little like nerdy information on our website, we tell you not only the barrel date, we tell you the transfer date, and then we tell you the bottling date. So you know exactly down to the day how long it was in a finishing barrel. I'm always amazed at how is untransparent a word?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm always amazed.
Lack of transparency.
Nobody tells you that. Like it's like, why did you pull it out at 6 months? Like, why didn't you leave it in for 8? Or, in this case, like, tell me a little bit, what was it like after a couple months? What was it like after a year? Why did you decide to age it entirely in that barrel versus, you don't hear those stories. And I think now more than ever, with people being more educated about whiskey, because they listen to tremendous podcasts like Whiskey Uncut.
That's true.
I mean, we teach. That's what we do, Paul. We just teach. But when when you have more information like that, you're gonna want to know even more information. And so the lack of transparency in Scotch is one of the things that bothers me.
Yes.
About that category.
Especially, and I do find it, I find it frustrating because typically when you have like something that has an older tradition behind it, there's more more transparency of stuff,
yeah.
right? Like if you look at like French wine,
I was going to say
right?
like champagne.
Yeah, or champagne, right?
Yeah.
It's not, none of like the regulations of what defines champagne as champagne have been like made recently. They're all like 500 years old. That's like, it's been like a protected, very little change allowed for a long time.
Yeah, and it's very tightly regulated, and you know exactly what you're getting. That's the whole point of all the regulation.
And so it has always baffled me that the Scotch industry is not really in that regard. But the paxarette is a situation where they did that. They said, no, we're gonna define this as an additive because it's there go the lights again.
Whenever the refrigerator kicks on, I think that's what happens.
We're gonna define this as an additive. We're not gonna allow it anymore. And so that gives me hope that the E158 artificial coloring will follow suit and be considered that way.
To me, coloring is horrible because you're deceiving the consumer.
But it might have also just been the way they were applying it, of like dumping it in by the cupful versus it being just, again,
if you're adding it directly to the whiskey, but if you're seasoning the barrel with it,
right? I don't know.
But again, Scotch is weird because they're very, very picky about certain things
and not others,
and they don't give a shit about others. It's like, we're gonna really say it has to be this, but you can throw some caramel coloring in it. Nobody cares.
So
it's really weird. So
here's the regulation to be certified as a sherry cask. Now, in 2015, the Consejo Regulador registered the Sherry Cask brand and drafted a document to regulate production of sherry seasoned casks for quality control. So thankfully in 2015, somebody took notice in Spain and was like, all right, we need to at least set some standard of what, because there's so much contention around this whole issue. So here's what that is. The casks must be filled to at least 85% of total volume with a certified sherry wine made by bodegas registered bodegas. The cask has to continuously hold the wine at the required fill level throughout the entire seasoning process. This means bodegas cannot empty the cask and refill it with other wines in between. The minimum seasoning period is 1 year. So
that's decent.
Like
you sort of know what you're getting in the barrel then.
All right. So yes, they've added some regulation, but if Macallan is claiming, oh, we use only the best sherry seasoned casks, and Balvenie says we just use seasoned sherry casks, there's nothing like Macallan, there's nothing holding them necessarily to the fact that there's any older sherry seasoning the cask.
And it doesn't sound like there's anybody tracking it.
And so perhaps it doesn't matter. Perhaps you can't really taste it, without doing a side by side. The second is what we talked about earlier, reuse of sherry. So furthermore, there is no regulation how many times the same sherry can be reused for seasoning.
So you could dump it out, put it back in something else, dump it out, put it back in something else.
So you could take it from one barrel for a year, put it in the next barrel for a year, etc. So,
that's pretty awesome though.
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
And
now, it's efficient, right? Like you don't have to make new product, I guess, but
correct. But here's the secondary effect of that sherry becomes aged sherry as it goes on. And now we all win because 10 years from now we'll be drinking the same sherry season. So maybe the sherry seasoned cask will naturally get better because it's cheaper for them to just reuse it over and over.
Yeah, and you would think that each time you moved it into a new barrel, it's going to get better, right? So every barrel it produces that season maybe is a little bit more higher quality.
It's possible.
I mean, again, if we know what the hell we're talking about, and you can tell any difference between the barrels, it's kind of hard to say.
Yeah.
Now I know with American whiskeys, and we're going to get in. I poured you a little bit of the Middle West.
Mm-hmm.
Here, like to get a lot of people just go through a barrel broker. So you go to a barrel broker, they have a list of barrels that are available. One of them says Sherry Cask, you buy it and you throw your bourbon in.
That's what they do in Scotland.
Yeah, and you have really no idea what in the hell it is. Like you may get a little bit of information. Here you get that this is...
By the way, this smells like popcorn.
It does. Yeah, I know.
Popcorn covered in like fruits.
Like fruity drizzle.
Fruity drizzle. It's amazing. It's really good.
It says bourbon whiskey aged in Spanish Solera sherry casks.
Okay.
6-year double barrel matured, meaning that it was aged in its original barrel and then it was finished in this sherry cask. And it's a 4-grain bourbon, so it's corn, wheat, rye, and barley. And it's 6 years old. This is a special release from Middle West.
So do you want to explain what Solera is a bit?
You go for it.
Okay. So the Solera aging, and this is our third type of sherry cask on display, for this episode. So you have the second fill, or the, blend of different fills for the 25, the first fill for the Balvenie. This is Solera. Solera is basically a barrel that they never allowed to empty all the way. However, technically, a Solera barrel would only have to contain 1 drop of sherry left in it each time they empty it out,
yep.
or of whiskey, right?
Yeah.
And so what they're doing is they've got, generally it's like a 5,000 liter or 10,000 liter barrel, oak barrel, and it's not really a barrel because the top is open, but the bottom and sides are closed, and it's basically 20 feet across, and they fill it up with sherry over and over again, and then once a year or every 6 months or whatever, who knows, they pull a little bit out to fill up some barrels to season the barrels that then they would send to this to Middle West to use. And so that sherry that's aged, that's seasoning the barrel, contains some elements of sherry that could be 30 or 40 or 50 years old, depending on how long the Solera is.
Droplets.
Right.
Probably. But yeah, that's the idea, is that it's this blend of continuously aging. And so, and it makes a
very consistent product.
Yeah. And it's kind of cool in the sense too, that it reflects like years and years and years of production at one site, right? All sort of mingling together. There's whiskey people that do Solera aging as well. It's done a little bit differently, but for this, I think it's a really interesting product. They do 2 special releases a year. They do this sherry cask, and then they also do a port finished rye. And I picked them up this past year. I think it's super unique. I will say I don't think sherry plays as well in bourbon as it does with Scotch.
I don't think it's
is
as
already
noticeable.
So flavorful that it doesn't. Yeah, I sometimes feel like they fight a little bit, because bourbon is a very bold, like kind of rustic feel on the palate, and Scotch is not. Scotch is a little bit more mellow, and I think it plays with the sherry better. The only other one that I know of is the Belmead Sherry Cask, which you thought you had and you didn't.
No.
But I was traveling. I was seeing my dad this weekend, and we stopped at a restaurant and they had it. So I tried it. It was $9 for a pour, which I thought was
a good price.
Ridiculously stupid cheap.
It's like a $70 bottle.
Yeah, $70 to $80.
Yeah.
And I bought it. Much more cocoa forward than what this one is. This one's like you mentioned, it's kind of corny and it's very fruity. That one was a little bit more cocoa-ish. Mm-hmm. And to me, right on the nose, it smelled more like sherry than bourbon. This one smells like bourbon coated sherry. Like you can tell that both of them are in there. What do you think of this one though? I was really curious as a Scotch drinker what you thought of this one.
Oh, I think it's delicious.
You like this one a lot?
I think the finish is a little short, but and I think that comes from the dryness of the sherry kind of fighting a little bit with like the sweetness of the bourbon, but
you're right though, it doesn't linger. You get a big punch of flavor up front, and then you get a little bit of like maybe like a cocoa-y chocolate note like on the mid palate, and then it just kind of goes away.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's really good. I've never found sherry on bourbon. Like it's not as obvious or dramatic as it is on Scotch. It's simply because I think some of the caramely, like brown sugar notes that you tend to get in bourbon, and like the darker fruit notes, like Scotch naturally has more of like bright, like appley kind of fruit notes, which are different from what you get from sherry. I feel like there's a lot of bourbons just aged in standard American oak barrels where I get more like fig, kind of dark fruity-esque flavors that are similar to the sherry flavors. And so
yeah, that's what it's just so heavy,
and like the
you're
nutty,
you're using fresh barrels, you're using fresh char barrels, high char barrels. So you're already getting in a lot of those deeper, richer, earthy
Yeah.
notes. Sometimes you do get like almost like a chocolatey cocoa
Right.
note from the barrel.
So I
think they fight a little bit.
yes, and I think they kind of, I don't know. I feel like they go well together, but yeah, it's to me it's less dynamic than it is on a single malt Scotch.
I think in general, I'm just not as big of a fan of finished bourbon. I think finished rye is amazing. I think you can do some really cool stuff with rye. Bourbon, I have a harder time with. Like it's so sweet and flavorful by itself
James,
that it's hard to do.
You know, James, what you're really searching for is the fact that bourbon is superior to rye, and so it's perfect already. And rye is inherently flawed
Is that what it is?
Needs the secondary cask to help it be palatable.
I think what I was getting to was that bourbon is so good it doesn't need the secondary cask, whereas Scotch is crap.
Oh no!
And it does,
no.
because Scotch without the sherry cask is
Amazing.
undrinkable.
It's not.
Like it's undrinkable.
It's not.
It's all about the sherry. People don't go out there and hunt down like everything they hunt down with Scotch is super, super old, and it's those first fill sherry barrels.
Yeah. Or really peaty.
Because by itself it's garbage.
Or really peaty. I do. Okay.
Is there an example of a sherry cask with a really peaty bourbon? Or Scotch, I mean?
Yes. Yeah, there are some. Yeah.
Yeah, because that's not something I see very often either.
No. And I've had some that are really bad.
I would imagine that.
And some that are really good. But I do have one if you want to grab it and try it real quick. As
Sure.
long as
Which
we're on
one
the
is it?
topic. See that Kilhoman top shelf? It's behind that. It's the Kilhoman Saneg. I probably butchered that pronunciation. I know how to pronounce most things related to Scotch, but every now and then I can't remember. You have to look it up though. That's the problem. You got to memorize it all.
How to pronounce them all.
How to pronounce it all. Yeah, so this is Kilhoman, which is one of the newest distilleries on Isla. 46% ABV, natural color, non-chill filtered.
So this is peated and
sherry.
finished in sherry.
Aged all in sherry. I think.
All in sherry. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the final little tidbit on the sherry cask situation is the fact that the traditional transport casks, which would have been the ones the whiskey was actually being aged in, would have all been European oak. And now, because of the additional requirements to get a lot more casks and everything, and the prevalence of American distilleries wanting sherry casks also, there's a lot of American oak barrels being used for that process also. So you have less, unless a distillery specifically states that they're using a European sherry oak cask, you don't know if it's European or American oak sherry. And because of that, the European oak sherries or casks are going to be more tannic and dry, and the American ones are going to have some brighter, vanilla.
And some of these blends are probably both, right?
Correct.
Yeah. That is really fucking weird. Like, I don't even know what to say about it. It's like you lit fruit on fire.
Yeah.
Like, it's really odd.
Now, to me, this is incredible. This is like everything I love in a glass.
I don't know,
wrapped
man.
up.
It confuses my brain. Like,
dude, that's so.
See, here's
good.
what it does though. I'll take a sip
That
of
is
it.
just like I could just.
I'll take a sip, and for a minute I like it.
I need a little baby Bjorn, and I could just wrap it around my chest.
I try it, and for like a second I like it, and then I absolutely hate it. And so I'm like, oh, which one was it? So I'll take another sip, and I'm like, oh, I like it, and then I hate it again. It's because you get the fruit first, and then the smoke lingers, and that peat lingers, and that's what really I don't like. But that's weird. I've never had anything like that before.
So, what is if you were going to lean towards one, would you say you preferred the really intense Balvenie first fill sherry, the more moderate Glenfarclas sherry, or the bourbon sherry?
I would go with the Glenfarclas sherry.
That's, I think, what most people would agree with. And I'll say this as someone who, like, coming up in the, becoming a whiskey enthusiast, I always saw articles about like, oh, it's a first fill sherry cask, like, ooh. And to some extent, that's true if you like that. But I'll tell you what, when you get that first bottle of something like, even something like Glendronach 18 is not a first fill sherry cask only, but they're definitely using a high portion of first fill sherry cask. It is so dominating in the flavor. I mean, like this Balvenie basically just tastes like sherry.
And
like,
I think that's my problem with it. And honestly, out of all the ones we tried, the Balvenie is my least favorite.
Really?
And I love Balvenie usually, you know that. But especially out of these three, I would rank it last. And it's because whatever whiskey is in there could be absolutely garbage.
Yeah.
And I would have no idea because it just tastes like sherry.
Yeah.
And so there's no complexity to it. Like it's rich and it's desserty.
Well,
but I can't. And by complexity, I mean in terms of balance between,
correct. Yes,
you know, the aspects and the notes that you're getting from the sherry and the notes that you're getting from the whiskey. In the Glenfarclas, I get both, and it's really well integrated. I get some fruity notes. I get those kind of classic barley notes, and so it's cohesive. The Balvenie is not cohesive.
Yeah, and that I think is a big. That's kind of where people are starting to like whiskey enthusiasts versus collectors are starting to skew apart. Is the collectors are still going for the rarer, less available things, which are first fill sherry, which are high proof, higher proof one-off versions of things, and the enthusiast crowd within the Scotch community is starting to say like, okay, well, the first fill sherry is like, that's good. Like we like that, but we also want to taste whiskey, in our whiskey.
Right. Yeah.
And so they're gravitating, interestingly, they're gravitating back more towards like ex-bourbon barrel only Scotches because
it makes sense. You're going to taste more of the grain. You're going to get, the bourbon influence, but you're going to taste more of the grain rather than just tasting cherry.
Yeah. And so, which I'm a little sad about because I don't fall in that camp. Like I like some ex-bourbon only Scotches, but to me, they're too simple because you really do. You kind of get like the malty, like you get the Scotch flavor of the barley, but that's kind of it. Yeah. There's not as many layers. So I like the balance in between. I like the more medium peat or medium amount of sherry where you can still kind of taste everything going on. So
yeah, I agree. But you've also been doing this.
But this is also,
time, so
I really like having this to pull out every now and then because it helps train your palate and, figure out where you are on the spectrum from no sherry influence to extreme.
Yeah, I mean, that's about as much as I've ever had. You want to just eat chocolate with it.
Yeah.
Like to cut it.
Speaking of which, James has just pulled out some really nice Ghirardelli dark cocoa chocolate, the finest of Italian chocolates
to sample
along with
scotches. They're sherry casks.
These like $150 bottles of scotch to pair.
So I figured we should do a food pairing to end the podcast. And I knew we were going to be trying these fine, high scale, like top shelf whiskeys. And so what better to pair them with than sour watermelon peeps for Easter? So that's what we're going to do. We're going to find out which one of these goes best with a sour watermelon peep.
Okay, so here's the thing. My dad is going to love this segment because my dad and I both love peeps. Like,
here, I will let you choose your own peep.
Oh, I can't even.
Look at him.
Oh, I can't look. It's so.
What I like about these is the outside is watermelon. Or sorry, the outside is sour. The inside is watermelon. So the inside of them are this fleshy pinky color. That when you bite into it is just like raw flesh.
That's hideous.
It's great. So here,
I don't even want to touch it.
Take your bloody peep. There you go. Yeah, look at that. God. Look at that fleshy pinkiness.
Yeah, look at that pink on the inside.
All right, so let's see.
It's also a horrible green color.
It tastes horrible green too.
Man, I love peeps, but this makes me sad.
All right, I'm thinking that this is going to go best with the Balvenie. So I'm going to start with that.
That's got to be the worst one. Well,
I think that's
maybe the
I think that's what I'm hoping for.
Oh god.
All right, so let's try with the Balvenie. Right, so
this makes
first of all, you got to smell the peep. You got to nose the peep.
Funnily enough, sugar and sweetness is one thing you can't smell. And because peeps are pure sugar, you can't actually smell a peep.
But it's fun to try. Yeah, that's horrible. All right. I'm going to try the bourbon.
I'll be honest, the peep is pretty good.
The peep's not bad. My dad made fun of me the whole weekend because he was like, "Are you really going to eat that?" And I'm like, "Yeah." Like, they're actually not. Once you get past the like horrible visual of biting into like a pink fleshy peep, they're pretty good.
Oh man, yeah, it's bad with the whiskey though.
You got to try it with a little bit of the bourbon. I think.
Okay, I'll try it with the bourbon.
I think the thing is that peeps are so Americana that you have to stick with Americana. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Here, let's try this now.
Oh man.
No, so once you bite into
you
bite into the peep, you start to get more aromatics off of it.
Yeah, you do.
Yeah. We're starting to figure out how to properly eat a peep.
Releasing the aromatics.
Let's see.
It does go better with the bourbon.
It honestly does.
But that's not a high bar to pass.
No, it couldn't have been much worse with the Belvini. But it does go better with the bourbon.
Oh man.
That was good. I'm glad we did that. So folks out there, and by the way, I bought this at the Dollar Tree. They were $1. So go out to the Dollar Tree, buy yourself some sour watermelon peeps.
Gosh, I feel sick.
And try with your favorite bourbon and write us and let us know what you think.
You know, honestly, the sour watermelon peep though tastes really good. It's really damn good.
I was happy I bought them because I was like, regular peeps are just like, yeah, they just taste like
they're played out
sugar marshmallow.
Yeah.
But this is, and you add in like the fact that it looks like you're eating an actual live animal while you eat it. It's pretty, it's pretty good. I like it.
The coloring's getting to me.
Yeah, but it's good.
Oh man.
So happy Easter, Paul.
Well, anyway. Yeah, happy Easter, James. Happy Easter to everyone listening to this. I think this will probably be up the week right after Easter because I think we're one episode in the catalog. But anyway, it's been I was going to say it's been a great tasting of
maybe not so much at the end.
Maybe not so much at the end. So anyway, that's your history lesson on the Sherry Cask and watermelon peep pairings.
Yeah,
so
it's good stuff.
Anyway, until next time, drink,
cheers,
share, enjoy.